So here we are back for part 2. Gives me a chance to have a swallow of coffee. So we were talking about performance monitoring reports. That's how you make sure that the organization is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Do you do them once a year? Do you do them every month? Well, it depends. Maybe the financial policies are monitored once a month. Maybe the human rights kinds of things about compliance with non-discrimination, maybe that's done once a year. Maybe that evidence actually comes from the Human Resources Department or something like that, where the evidence is no complaints, and so that's evidence. All this gets back to this idea that inherently there's some kind of a structure that organizations need to have. Here's a comment on slide number 14 from Harrison Owen, a big guy in the organization development world in terms of open space meeting, getting everybody involved in the decision-making process. And even though he was about everybody getting involved in the decision-making process, he was not anti-hierarchy. Structure is a good thing. During the 1990s, there was a lot of talk about eliminating hierarchy and flattening organizations in order to reduce administrative costs. Well, that just doesn't make sense at some point. Hierarchy is neutral, just like any other tool. It can be used for good or for evil. You could have the hierarchy of the Nazi SS troops. Was hierarchy, it was for a bad purpose. It doesn't make hierarchy bad, it means the SS people were bad. By the same token, you can have a very flat organization which is very ineffective but has got a laudable mission. It's just screwed up because it can't do things. So yes, we want to reduce unnecessary hierarchy, but we don't want to cripple the organization by eliminating necessary hierarchy. And the question is, what's the balance? The target is the unnecessary. The target is not the hierarchy. The next part of the board language is this part over here, the board CEO language on slide 15. There are about 6 or 7, I think, policies in this area. One of them is the Global Executive Director Board Linkage, which basically says that when it comes to the linkage between the board and the organization, the only person the board talks to is the CEO or superintendent or executive director. That's who we hold accountable for the performance of the entire organization, whether it's the United States Army or a little theater group. The question is, that's the nature of the hierarchy. The board holds one person accountable, and that's the gist of the board executive director linkage. The unity of control says that basically that no one on the board can give the executive director instructions as an individual unless the board has said, Michael, you go and tell the executive director to do this. That is, board members are only board members when there's a board meeting. Other than that, they're just folks. Unless the board has empowered them to do something on behalf of the board has directed you to do something, then the CEO needs to listen. Otherwise, the CEO can blow it off and say, if this isn't the board's direction, then I don't have to do it. So the board has to have this kind of sense of unity. We talk about it when I do the board development work as thinking with many minds and speaking with one voice. Once the board has taken a vote, there is no minority opinion. There's just, this is what the board decided, and you have to do what the board decided. And if you don't like what the board decided to do as a board member, get over it, because the board decided to do that. And you're the part of the board, and so you have to support it. Delegation to the executive director is another one. There are a handful. Each of them may have a paragraph or two in addition, but they're really not all that big a deal. So graphically speaking, this is the way things shake out. There is the community, which elects the board. There is the board, which picks the superintendent. There's the superintendent, which picks the principals. There are the principals, which pick the teachers. And this is the way it is supposed to work. You know, the symbols on the edges of slide 16 are trying to graphically again portray that the Board of Education does not give instructions to principals. Because if the board is giving direction around the superintendent to the principals, then the board cannot hold the superintendent accountable for the performance of the organization. You've undermined the superintendent's accountability by giving specific instructions to people below the superintendent. You can't do that and hold the superintendent accountable. You can easily imagine things like this happening. And it could well be that public education is the poster child for poor adoption of this philosophy, despite the fact that some school districts, for instance Minneapolis, nominally adhere to the Carver Policy Model. In reality, I don't think they can spell Carver, much less actually abide by the policy framework. The question mark on the right side of slide 16 says, the superintendent may choose to talk to individual teachers and give them assignments, but if the superintendent, by the same token, if the superintendent talks to the teachers, the superintendent can no longer hold the principal accountable for the performance of the building because he has undermined the chain of command by going around it. Now, does that happen? Yeah, but it's not a good thing because it upsets the nature of accountability. It upsets the nature of accountability. And so a right-thinking superintendent would not go and talk directly to teachers about things that they're doing. He would go through the principal because that way you still hold the principal accountable. And this is one of the outs that people have is, well, you can't hold me accountable because you went around me and did X. Stop doing that, and then we can hold these people accountable, including ourselves. The last part up here is the board governance policies per se. This is the one about how the board behaves as a board. Typically, there's something called a global governance commitment, which is explained here. There's something called governing style. Governing style has 5 or 6 things below it. We're going to be strategic. We're going to be outward looking. We're going to have a sense of uniformity and consensus. We're going to bring in new blood periodically. Those are governing style kinds of things in there about how the board governs. There's also the board members' code of conduct, which is up in this area, which in case of nonprofits is spelled out in state law. In the case of charter schools, it's spelled out really strangely in state law, but that's a topic for a different discussion. Going on to slide 18. Apart from being prudent and ethical, the activities that go on at or below the level of the chief executive are completely immaterial. That is, the board gives the superintendent his marching orders and then gets out of the way. And what happens below that is what we call DBI, detail beyond interest. The board does not care how the superintendent accomplishes the mission, provided that he does accomplish it and not violate any of the proscribed limitations. I liken this to soccer. I'm not a big soccer expert, but it seems to me like soccer's got like 5 rules. Baseball's got 1,000,000 rules. Soccer's got like 5. You can't hit the ball with your hand on purpose. You got to keep the ball in bounds. You can't be offsides. You can't endanger his play. And the mission is to put the ball in the net more often than the other guys do. The rules of soccer do not say you have to catch the ball with your chest and then drop it to your left knee, lower it carefully to the ground, and strike it with the outside of your right foot. That would be silly, but that's the way many organizations are set up. Here's what you have to do. Wrong. It's not about here's what you have to do. It's here's what you can't do. Here are the 4 things you can't do in soccer. It's a much smaller list. It's much easier to manage. It's much easier to detect infractions because you're told people what they can't do. So as long as the executive director is achieving the ends and not violating limitations, everything else is irrelevant from the board's perspective. Another guy who wrote on this similar topic about the importance of hierarchy is a guy named Elliot Jakes. He's a Canadian researcher. He started working during World War II with the Canadian Army. He worked with many, many large Canadian and United States organizations in terms of helping to understand what he called the managerial accountability hierarchy. This is the way things should be set up, because this is what organizations that are effective do. Let's look at this empirically. Organizations that do this don't work. Organizations that do this do work. And his thinking is very much consistent with, but different focus from Carver's. One of the things that Jakes says is that a really interesting thing from my perspective is that organizations naturally have, if I can turn a page here, organizations naturally have 7 stratum, from stratum 7 down through stratum 6, down to stratum 1, stratum 2. And that what distinguishes these stratums within organizations is the time frame that they're comfortable with. So someone operating at level 1 is going to be on something, I don't get the numbers exactly right, the 1 to 90 day time frame, that your decisions will play out within the next month or 2. That's a level 1 thing. The first level up from that, first level of supervision, level 2, this is people who are going to be like 90 to 360 days, where your decisions are going to be played out within the next several months, maybe a year, and so on up until you get to this one, which is kind of fascinating. This is the 50 years and more. 50 years and more. That's a level 7 organization. He calls that a super organization. The only organization that I've encountered in my reading that's like that is Mitsubishi Bank in Japan. Mitsubishi Bank, it's also motor companies and they make TVs and a bunch of stuff. But they've actually got a 50-year strategy. They're the only company I know that does that. 3M is probably a level 5 or a level 6 organization. I think this is 20 to 50, and this is 10 to 20 years. 3M probably ought to be here. A school district seems like it ought to be here, oughtn't it? Because you get kids in grade K, and you're going to have them for the next 13 years. You kind of ought to have a 13-year plan, it seems like. And what's interesting about Jake's work is his observation that if you take someone who is a level, let's go down another level, let's go down to level 4. If you take someone who is a level 4 person and you put him into a job that calls for a level 5 person, the organization becomes a level 4 organization. That is, this person will shrink the organization back to what he's comfortable with because he can't cope with the higher level, longer time frame. Jake's is another person who's very confident, and so confident, in fact, that he has an assessment tool that he can give you at any point in your career and say, gosh, you are now at 31 and you're at this level, therefore you're going to plateau at this level. It's a very interesting claim, but he's got a lot of people who bought into it hook, line, and sinker, so I guess he's probably close to right. So, Elliot Jaques, Requisite Organization, another cool book to look at. Again, if you'd like the notes for any of the books, I'm happy to share them with you. The next author on page 20 is Margaret Wheatley, who came to my attention in the early 1990s, writing on the idea of, this was when sort of chaos and uncertainty and complexity theory was really just sort of becoming a part of the everyday conversation in the business world, largely driven by the Santa Fe Institute. Meg Wheatley was one of these who was sort of an early adopter of this idea that organizations are necessarily uncertain, they're necessarily chaotic. So how do we deal with that? And her response is, if we succeed in maintaining focus rather than hands-on control, we create the flexibility and responsiveness that every organization craves, whether it's the local chapter of the United Way or your particular school. You need to have enough flexibility to get the job done, and you need to know what the job is you're trying to get done. You need to have both of those things. One of the potential barriers that some organizations have, the next page, is this idea that, well, you have to work with the rest of the world. I can have a really cool organization, but I have to interface with the rest of the world, which is less cool. For instance, Family Network said no standing committees because that's the Carver Policy way. We do not have an executive committee, we do not have a finance committee, we do not have a personnel committee, we do not have a property acquisition committee. We just have the board because the board is responsible for that stuff. United Way says you got to have a finance committee or we won't, to oversee the direction, oversee the finances, or we won't give you any money. Well, that undercuts the idea of the board as being the sole point of focus here. But to get the money from United Way, we created a finance committee. We just did it in a way which allowed us to be true to the spirit of Carver Policy Governance while violating the letter and having this particular standing committee. Carver Policy says if you want to have a committee, have an ad hoc committee. You need to get something done, create it. You need to have a fundraising campaign, create a fundraising ad hoc committee. Let it raise funds, and when it's done, shut it down and dissolve it. So that we don't wind up with creating unnecessary hierarchy. Page 22, we're getting sort of close to the end here. Page 22 is the standard table of contents for something, an organization that uses the Carver Policy Governance Model. You can see that there's 20-some pages. And this is a thin 3-ring binder to be containing policies of this gravity and this importance and this magnitude. And in fact, of the 22 pages, 19.31462 of those pages are right out of the template. You just get the template and you just adopt it because everything is there that you need to have. You tweak it a little bit. You know, for instance, if you're an organization of one size, you might have a limitation that says the executive director can't spend more than $10,000 at one time without board permission. If you're a larger organization, you might say the executive director cannot spend more than $10 million at one time without board authorization. But it's got to do with the size of the organization. And so there are some fill-in-the-blank kinds of things. But by and large, the policies for one organization are the same as the policies for another organization. What's different about every organization, what's different is this. This is what differentiates one organization from another, is the ends policy. Exec limitations policies are very much the same. Board CEO linkage policies are virtually always the same. Board governance has a couple of tweaks. You know, do you have term limits? Can you only be a board member for 2 terms in a row? Is a term 2 years or 3 years? Do we have a class of structure, so a certain number of board members rotate off every year so that we have a continuing supply of fresh blood? Those things are covered in the board governance policies, and there's slight adjustments you can make there, but by and large it's the same stuff, and it's 22 pages and it covers everything that needs to be covered at the board level. Now, if we're talking about a non-profit organization, there's a couple of other important documents which are covered in the next couple pages. If you're a non-profit, you also have, besides governance policies, which you ought to have articles of incorporation. That's what you file with the Secretary of State to be declared an organization, and in that you declare your quote-unquote charitable purpose. Why is it that you're going to exist in such a way that the taxpayers of Minnesota are not going to tax you with the property you own, the revenue that you generate, and so on? So you have articles of incorporation, which are typically signed. I mean, they're part of the birth of the organization. And then you have another set of things which you also have to have by law, which are called bylaws. And those things, by state law in Minnesota, and it's different from state to state, but in Minnesota those things have to cover the name and purpose of the organization again. They have to cover who the members of the organization are, and it has to outline the responsibilities of the board of directors. And it may cover other things as well, like do you have committees, how do you go about amending the bylaws and such. The problem with the bylaws and the articles is that they're very difficult to change. If you want to change the articles, you have to file paperwork with the state of Minnesota and demonstrate that you're still tax exempt. If you want to change the bylaws, typically it requires a vote of the entire membership, however membership has been defined in your bylaws. Interestingly, if you're a charter school in Minnesota, the people who vote on things like electing board members do not include current board members. And it doesn't include the kids. It includes the parents and the staff. So a part-time janitor gets to vote on who's on the board, but a sitting board member does not get to choose who sits on the board. Now that's just goofy, but that's the way the Minnesota law is written. It's very careful about who can vote in election of board members. So you want to have that not in clearly you got to abide by the law, but you want to have as many things as possible in the policies rather than in the bylaws, because the policies can be amended by the board itself at a regular board meeting. So therefore they're much more flexible. Typically you don't want to be flexing them. You want them to be stable over time, but you want to have the capability to change them as circumstances change. The last slide in the set is a bunch of references, books by John Carver, Harrison Owen, Meg Wheatley, Elliot Jakes. Again, for all of these books and 400 others, I've got my notes. If you want my notes on any of them, send me an email and I'll be happy to send them along to you. So my hope here is that in looking at the John Carver interview with Larry Spears, and then having seen this more expansion of what he was talking about there, that you'll have a sense of this is the way well thought out, well-functioned organizations run. There is clear accountability, there are clear rules, there are clear responsibilities, there's a clear mission, there's a clear proscription of what's not okay to accomplish the mission. And it is all of these things then that allow metrics to be put in place which allow the staff of the organization to demonstrate, yes, we have accomplished the mission and we have not broken any of the rules and we're doing fine. So I hope that's not too discouraging when you look at organizations that you may be affiliated with and see how far you are from this kind of clarity. But it's, it's about changing the world, right?